So we're finally at Mercury retrograde number 2 of 2022. And every time Mercury goes retrograde, for some people, it's the end of the world. For some people, it's a huge shift that really changes a lot for them. And in this video, I want to go over all of the specifics of what a Mercury retrograde is, what this Mercury retrograde is going to mean. And if you stick around to the end, I'm going to be going over how this Mercury retrograde is going to be affecting all of the zodiac signs. So before we go into this specific Mercury retrograde, I want to open up with one of the core principles of astrology is that life is cyclical. Things happen in cycles and nothing's ever new. Time is not linear. We know that time goes in a circle, right? And this is not our first Mercury retrograde in the sign of Gemini. And so if you want to know how this Mercury retrograde is going to be affecting you specifically, I want you to think back to the last time Mercury retrograded in Gemini, which was last year around this time of May and June of 2021. Let's go over that real quick. So at around the end of May and the beginning of June of 2021, as you can kind of see here, we had a Mercury retrograde, of course, in Gemini. Now, this one was a lot different because we had the nodes in Gemini and Sagittarius, which means that the eclipses were there. So when you have like an eclipse near a Mercury retrograde, as well as in the sign of Mercury, that one would be a much more of a bigger deal than maybe what this one's going to be. But I want you to think about what were you going through around May and June of 2021, because we're going to see not the same, but a similar theme repeat itself here, especially related to wherever Gemini rules in your chart. And of course, we're going to be going over what house Gemini rules in each one of the zodiac signs charts. And we'll be going over that in the end. But anyway, as I continue talking about this, think about the last time Mercury retrograded in Gemini, and you'll be able to have a pretty good idea of what this one has in store for you. So anyway, let's go ahead and begin. So in this video, I'm going to be using a lot of graphic animations to explain this Mercury retrograde. If you are a visual learner and maybe struggle reading your own birth chart or astrology, I want you to consider possibly taking my course. The link is in the description below. But all of these animations I'm about to show you, I took from my course. In my course, I actually have a whole lecture about retrograde planets in your birth chart. So if that's a confusing topic for you and you're a visual learner, again, I consider taking my course. It might help you a lot. So anyway, I'm bringing this up because it can get a little confusing of what we're looking at. And this is here on Earth. Imagine this is you right here. And you're looking up at the sky. And of course, we have Venus here. And then we have Mercury right here. So let's go over this a little bit. For those that aren't familiar, Mercury retrogrades are when Mercury appears to be moving backwards in the sky. Planets don't actually move backwards, of course. However, because of Mercury's orbit around the sun and our position of Earth, it appears as if Mercury is moving backwards. Now, what this looks like visually is we have Mercury, number one, being in direct motion. In astrology, direct motion is counterclockwise, a little counterintuitive. But anyway, what this looks like is for the majority of the time, Mercury is direct and it slowly goes over the other side of the sun. Notice that it goes behind the sun. And then when Mercury goes to the far side of the sun here, and this is Venus just for a visual reference, when Mercury goes to the far side, the far side of the sun, we get Mercury going retrograde. Notice that I put this little RX to symbolize it's going retrograde. Then as Mercury goes retrograde, it actually goes pretty quick. Notice how fast that goes. And notice that it went in front of the sun. That is because a Mercury retrograde is the time where Mercury goes in between the sun and the earth. And even though Mercury is just kind of going around the sun like this, it appears as if it's moving backwards. So let's go ahead and talk about the specifics of this Mercury retrograde. Mercury entered shadow on April 26th at 26 degrees Taurus. Now, what does that mean? That means Mercury hit this specific degree of the zodiac sign. It's going to go into Gemini, hit a specific degree of the zodiac sign. It will then move backwards and it will come right back to this spot. So what does this mean? Mercury shadow phase. Events, conversations that happen on this day. Let me actually go backwards here. That's April 26th. Think about what was going on for you around April 26th. We're going to come back to that. And whatever happens on this day, really plant the seeds of what the retrograde phase will deal with. So maybe that was a conversation. Maybe you made some plans. Maybe you got a weird email, or maybe your phone started acting weird. I want you to think about what was going on for you, because what was going on, you're going to come back to here in just a moment. So again, whatever happens on this day is something you're going to come back to due to a delay or a miscommunication or a change of plans. So maybe you made some plans. Maybe, you thought things were in motion. Maybe that's not true. And you're going to come back to that spot and kind of rethink that whole situation. So let's move forward. Something I want to specifically talk about with this Mercury retrograde, something that's actually really interesting about it, is when Mercury first went into shadow, as you can see here at 26 Taurus, it made this square to Saturn. Saturn rules authorities and discipline and structures and all of that type of hardcore stuff, right? And as Mercury squared Saturn, there might have been maybe a resistance or, a miscommunication with an authority. This is important because we're going to come back to this. Mercury will station direct squaring Saturn. And so maybe, you were trying to communicate something and move forward past an authority. Or maybe you had a lot of limits or delays or a lot of responsibility. Mercury's going to come back to this. And this Mercury square Saturn thing is actually a really big deal. So just hold on to that in the back of your head. We'll get to that. So Mercury enters shadow, of course, on April 26th at 26 degrees Taurus. If you have any specific planets at 26 degrees Taurus, this Mercury retrograde will affect you a little bit more. But at this time, Mercury's still in direct motion. It's still technically moving forward. But then Mercury starts to, quote unquote, slow down as it begins to go retrograde. Mercury stations retrograde on May 10th, and this is the point in which it begins to appear to be moving backwards. This happens at 4 degrees Gemini, which is pretty important because Mercury rules the sign of Gemini. Zodiac signs are merely houses. And just like, in the world, people own houses. The house in and of itself doesn't really do much. The person who owns it is kind of like the facilitator of that house. And Mercury facilitates Gemini. Gemini is all about communication, intellect, data, conversation, sharing ideas. And so when Mercury goes retrograde in the sign of Gemini, there's this rethinking of ideas or rethinking of data or maybe a miscommunication with data. Gemini is all about that free-flowing conversation and that stimulation. And Mercury is all about, again, communicating that, thinking about that stuff. And as Mercury goes backwards here, if you're not familiar with what a retrograde is, it's really a time to rethink things. Let's go ahead and get into that. So Mercury stations retrograde on May 10th. So whatever it is you were planning on moving forward on related to Mercury, so like whether it's ideas or plans, communication, technology, especially technology, Mercury retrogrades are infamous for, phones breaking, laptops breaking, all of that stuff. All of that becomes delayed. So as you thought things were building up and moving forward, we get to May 10th and it's like, oh, we got to go back on all this real quick. So whatever problems you're going to experience become evident at this point. This is important to understand the difference of, because when Mercury enters shadow, you'll start to kind of see things, Mercury retrograde themes activate. So for example, maybe your phone starts kind of being a little bit glitchy or something like that. But then Mercury stations retrograde and you figure out the problem with your phone, or at least the problem becomes so overwhelming that you can't do anything about it. It becomes very evident what the problem is at this point. Another thing with Mercury retrogrades is expect to slow down. Retrogrades are a time to rethink, re-strategize, replan, and see different perspectives. So as you're thinking about, what this Mercury retrograde is going to do for you, I want you to think about seeing a different perspective on whatever house that Gemini rules in your chart. And again, we're going to be going over that in the end of this video, so make sure you stick to the end of this. But as Mercury stations retrograde, this is where we're going to be rethinking all of this stuff. So we get to, of course, the station phase. This is on May 10th. Then Mercury will slowly go backwards, and then it conjoins the sun. This is what we call the Mercury Cazimi point. This happens on May 21st at 0 degrees Gemini. So Cazimi is a fancy word for just conjoining the sun. Now, it's not actually going to conjoin the sun exactly in the middle. That is called an occultation in astronomy, but this is astrology. We're not talking about that stuff. But this was just for a visual reference. Mercury Cazimis are known as the halfway point in a Mercury retrograde. They kind of symbolize the, you're in the middle of it, right? This happens at 0 degrees Gemini, so this is kind of important, of course, if you have a planet at 0 Gemini. But let's talk about what a Cazimi is. Mercury Cazimi, again, this is on May 21st. So think about these dates, too, because these dates are, what's fun about astrology is, astrologers may not be able to be super exact on what the event will be, but we're pretty exact on what day it's going to happen. So pay attention to April 26th. What was the other one? May 10th, May 21st. But the Mercury Cazimi point is the halfway point of a retrograde. That means whatever the problem becomes very clear. So if you were like, rethinking things or re-strategizing things, or again, solutions become clear, the timeline becomes clear, and it's clear on what has to be redone. This is super important because while Mercury goes retrograde, you will start rethinking things and the challenge will be brought to you. A lot of traditional ancient astrologers talk about retrogrades being malefic, which means they're problematic. Like, they're not always fun, but oftentimes, like tragedies and horrible things oftentimes bring a lot of meaning and inspiration and good things later on. But as Mercury stations retrograde, there's this there's a delay. I miscommunicated something. Oh, I wasn't thinking about that clearly. But then Mercury goes Cazimi, and this is where you go, that's what I messed up. That's what wasn't, going to work. So much becomes clear at this point. And whatever you have to redo or rethink or re-strategize becomes very clear. So let's keep moving forward here. We have the Mercury Cazimi point on May 21st at 0 Gemini, and then it will continue to move backwards until we get to June 3rd. This is when Mercury stations direct. Now, again, Mercury doesn't move forward or backward. It's always moving the same way, but this is the point in which it starts to go on the far side of the sun. Of course, this happens at 26 Taurus, where it originally entered shadow. So again, Mercury went here, came back, and now it's right back where it started. So whatever you were talking about or planning or thinking or writing or anything Mercury related around April 26th, you're going to come back to. But the difference with this one, let's actually talk about this real quick. Mercury stationing direct. Retrograde is over. Things clear up and begin to move forward. Again, back to where you originally started. But how, and that's usually a good thing. But remember how I said Mercury entered shadow squaring Saturn? So Saturn is walls, limitations, discipline. Saturn rules the cold and the night and the darkness and things like that. And a square aspect, which also I go over aspects in my How to Read Your Birth Chart course. So if aspects are confusing for you, I really break it down in a very simple manner. But a square aspect often represents a challenge or a check. That doesn't necessarily mean bad because in life, when you kind of are easy on yourself, kind of things go a little bit south versus when, there's a little bit hard of a check. It kind of gives you the ability to move forward, be stronger, be wiser, right? And we're all in this to be better people, right? Not just enable shitty behavior, right? Anyway, Mercury stations direct on June 3rd. The retrograde is over. Things will clear up, but Mercury comes back. Again, this is April 24th. Mercury squared Saturn. Then on June 3rd, Mercury comes back to Taurus and makes an exact square to Saturn. This is important because most Mercury retrogrades represent things like delays and things taking a while. Mercury moving slowly represents things, again, taking a while. But the fact that it's squaring Saturn, times that by 1,000. Saturn rules slowness and time and things taking forever. It rules old people, right? And so as Mercury squares Saturn, there is definitely a delay. What's also interesting about this too is right as Mercury stations direct on June 3rd, 2 days later, on June 5th, Saturn stations retrograde. You see how it turns red right there? Saturn goes retrograde. Again, and I talk about this in my course, Saturn goes retrograde once every year, but is mostly retrograde for like 6 or 8 months out of the year. So it's retrograde for quite a while. Most of you will probably have Saturn retrograde in your birth charts. However, as Saturn stations retrograde, Saturn being direct is you're given more responsibilities, you're giving more, or you are given more duties, or you are taking on more of a responsible, more mature role. But then as Saturn stations retrograde, all of that starts to hit you. The analogy I like to make is, getting the promotion to management, to being the boss, is fun at first until you have to be the manager that, has to fire someone or deal with all the crappy things that managers and bosses have to deal with. You have to be that authority. You have to be that Saturn figure. And no one really ever likes to be that sometimes. I mean, if you're like me, I kind of like to be that. But anyway, Mercury will square Saturn, and then Saturn stations retrograde, which let's think about that symbolically for a minute. We have this rethinking of an area of our lives. Mercury goes back into Taurus, where the sign of Taurus is about value, security, nourishment, enjoyable sensation, right? And as Mercury goes back into Taurus, we're rethinking this idea. And as we rethink that, it squares the planet Saturn in Aquarius, where maybe we have to, again, look at a bigger picture. What is actually going to work? Saturn rules infrastructures and plans and institutions. And I think as Mercury squares Saturn, maybe the ideas that you have maybe need to be a little bit more checked from institutions or, it's Saturn and Aquarius. This is talking about like society stuff, government stuff. So anyway, as Mercury stations direct squaring Saturn, it sounds like things will probably be delayed a little bit longer than you expected. And this might be a tension between communication and ideas with authorities, with people that are in charge of you. So let's go back to this. Mercury stations direct on June 3rd and begins to move forward. Then the final piece of a Mercury retrograde is when Mercury, quote unquote, leaves shadow. So this is again at 4 degrees Gemini. This is on June 18th. And that means, again, Mercury entered shadow. It went here, stationed retrograde, came back here, and then it moved forward again. So Mercury's going over this same spot of the sky 3 times. So if you have any planets in your birth chart from 26 Taurus to 4 degrees Gemini, pay attention because this will be much more prominent for you. I dropped my pen, sorry. Anyway, let's go ahead and start talking about how this Mercury retrograde is going to be affecting each one of the zodiac signs. Now, to kind of wrap up the shadow phase and Mercury leaving shadow is, once Mercury leaves shadow, you're moving on from everything that you had to deal with. It all gets cleared up, it all gets worked out, and you finally get to move on with your life. So again, let me go backwards here. So that's from April 26th. Actually, that looks like crap. Let me do that again. So this is from April 26th through June 18th. Quite a bit of time, a little bit over a month and a half. You're going to be going over a lot of the same stuff over the same period. So just remember, not a lot of things are going to be moving too quickly as far as plans and communication, dealing with like authorities and things that might be out of your control. But anyway, let's go ahead and start talking about how this is going to affect the zodiac signs. So Aries, Mercury rules your 3rd house and your 6th house. The 3rd house is all about communication, short distance travel, siblings, neighbors, technology. The 9th house is like spirituality and higher education. And the 3rd house is like basic education and how you apply what you've learned. And as Mercury goes retrograde in this area, you're going to be rethinking all of this stuff. Short distance travel, siblings, neighbors, communication. Mercury also rules your 6th house of your work, employment, labor, health. And so as the planet that rules health, labor, and work, you're going to be rethinking these things. But Mercury will go back into your 2nd house of money, finances, resources, possessions. So there's something about your plans and your habits and your schedule that is going to be kind of delayed, and it will go into a money thing. It's going to be maybe you're waiting for some money to come in and it gets a little bit delayed and then you get the money. But then it squares Saturn, and Saturn's in your 11th house of friends and community. So as Saturn stations retrograde, a lot of this is going to be about money and possessions related to friends and communities and networks. Let's move on to Taurus. Taurus, Mercury rules your 2nd house of Gemini. Your 2nd house, which rules money, finances, resources, possessions. It also coincides with food too, and like energy. But Mercury also rules your 5th house of love, romance, sex, pleasure, self-expression, identity, children. And as the planet that rules your 2nd house of money, finances, and resources, and 5th house of like art, music, and pleasure, it goes retrograde. You're going to be rethinking all of this kind of stuff and how you interpret it and how you interact with it. And Mercury will go retrograde and go back into Taurus, into your first house. Your first house rules yourself, your body, your image, your worldview, and your perception. So there's something about related to money, finances, and art that changes your perception of yourself or how you express yourself. This coincides with Saturn going retrograde, and Saturn's in your 10th house of career, legacy, bigger life events, mostly career and work stuff. And Saturn's been in your 10th house, so you've been taking on a lot more responsibility. You've been gaining positions of leadership. And maybe something around money and finances, along with the way that you identify yourself, is going to get delayed with the responsibilities that you've been taking at work. So maybe this is like a change in your income, or maybe you took on a bunch of responsibility and it was like a learning period and now you're kind of rethinking it. That's what I would really look for. So then we get to Gemini. Of course, Gemini, Mercury rules your first house of yourself, your body, your image, how you view yourself, how you express yourself. It also rules your fourth house of home, family, living situation, parents. The planet that rules the first house of self and the fourth house of family is going retrograde. So you're rethinking all of these things. But then Mercury will go back into your 12th house of the subconscious, fears, and hidden enemies, isolation, alienation, and like self-healing. So as Mercury goes back into Taurus and goes into your 12th house, you might be a little bit stuck in the back of your head. As well, when Mercury does station direct, it will square Saturn. And Saturn's in your 9th house right now. The 9th house is all about spirituality, religion, higher education. And as Saturn's been there, this has been a little bit of a rough area. You're learning a lot, but also feeling a lot of weight and responsibility. And I think as Mercury goes back into your 12th house and square Saturn, there might be a hidden enemy related to 9th house topics. So the 9th house also rules social media, publishing, higher education, astrology, spirituality. So there might be a big rethink and a big shift in how you see yourself related to your spirituality and your personal beliefs. And that also might include family stuff too. Cancer. Mercury rules your 12th house, which rules the subconscious, isolation, alienation, hidden enemies, things that you don't see. But Mercury also rules your 3rd house of short distance traveling, cars, neighbors, siblings, communication, technology. 3rd house rules a lot of stuff. As the planet that rules these houses goes retrograde, you're going to be rethinking these topics. So again, 12th house is, your subconscious, things that you don't like thinking about. Same thing with your 3rd house of like siblings, neighbors, and Mercury will go back into your 11th house of friends. So this might be a fallout with a friend potentially, but as Mercury goes back into your 11th house of friends, there's again, 12th house hidden enemies, 11th house of friends. A friend turns into an enemy. And as Mercury stations direct, it's going to square Saturn, and Saturn will go retrograde in your 8th house. This has been hard for you guys. The 8th house rules shared resources, debt, other people's money, things that are out of your control, the occult and secrets, and it's a little rough. So as Mercury squares Saturn, I think you're going to be learning who to trust and who not to trust with information. Let's go to Leo. Leo, Mercury rules your 11th house of friends, communities, pretty much networking, your friends, essentially. But Mercury also rules your 2nd house of money, finances, resources, possessions. So as this planet goes retrograde, you're going to be rethinking topics around friends and community, but also related to money and finances. Mercury will then go into your 10th house of your career, public notoriety, how the world sees you. And so you're going to be reshifting, the people that you hang out with based off of either career stuff or work stuff. But Mercury will station direct square Saturn. So there's a specific authority figure or a specific relationship. I mean, Saturn's in your 7th house of relationships, so this is very heavy with relationships. That something about whatever you're doing in work, there's something about an authority or relationship that's going to have some either boundaries or distance, or something's it's going to take a little while, and there's going to be some tension there. Virgo. Mercury rules your 1st house of yourself, your body, your identity, how you see yourself, most specifically body stuff. But Mercury also rules your 10th house of your career, public notoriety, how the world sees you. So as Mercury retrogrades and is changing and you're rethinking these two areas of your life, you're going to be rethinking about who you are, what you do in this world. This is probably going to be a job change. But then as Mercury goes direct in your 9th house of spirituality, religion, far distance travel, you're going to be rethinking your beliefs. Or maybe even going to school to upgrade your career or travel for your career. But Mercury will station direct squaring Saturn. Saturn is in your sixth house of work, labor, routines, health, and a Saturn stations retrograde here with Mercury squaring it. Something about your spirituality or your beliefs or your higher education is going to get delayed because of work stuff, probably. So, Libra, Mercury rules your 12th house of isolation, alienation, the subconscious, fears, and hidden enemies. And Mercury also rules your 9th house of spirituality, religion, personal beliefs, higher education. Did I ever say that? As Mercury goes retrograde, you're going to be rethinking these two topics in your life. You know, fears and things that you don't usually like to think about, and your beliefs in the world. Mercury will then go into your 8th house of shared resources, other people's money, debt, inheritance, death. And so these two topics are going to come back to 8th house stuff of shared resources, other people's money. And it's going to square Saturn in your 5th house of love, romance, sex, pleasure, vices, partying, self-expression, children. And so there's something related to this 8th house of shared resources getting in the way of pleasure or self-expression. And Saturn's in your 5th house. So there's not a lot of fun going on right now. And you're trying to figure out what fun even means for you. And I think this will be a pretty radical rethink of your own way of enjoying things. Scorpio, Mercury rules your 11th house of friendships, communities, networks, groups of people, but it also rules your 8th house of shared resources, other people's money, debt, inheritance, and death. And as Mercury goes retrograde in your 8th house, you're going to be rethinking debt, inheritance, other people's money, especially related to friends. Maybe you're going to be at the mercy of some friends and maybe you're borrowing stuff from them or maybe they're borrowing stuff from you. But as Mercury goes into your 7th house of relationships, there'll be a bigger focus on relationships, other people, individuals, but it will square Saturn in your 4th. So there's something about this relationship stuff that you're going through that's something about your living situations getting in the way of relationships, or there is some tension with a specific relationship regarding the home and the family life. So then we get to Sagittarius, my personal sign. And Mercury is going to rule your 10th house of your career, public notoriety, how the world sees you. But it also rules your 7th house of relationships, other people and other individuals, all types of relationships. Like especially even specifically clients too. As Mercury retrogrades in your 7th house, you're going to be rethinking relationships and individuals and how you interact with them and what you think about them, especially related to career topics. As Mercury goes back into your 6th house of work, labor, routines, day-to-day habits, there'll be a bigger emphasis on what you need to do every day. And it's going to square Saturn. Saturn's in your 3rd house. So siblings, neighbors, day-to-day activities, communication, things like that. There's something along the lines of your schedule is getting in the way of your work. And you're going to be rethinking how you interact with relationships based off that. So then we get to Capricorn. Mercury rules your 9th house of spirituality, religion, far distance travel, higher education, personal beliefs, publishing, social media, and things like that. But Mercury also rules your 6th house of work, day-to-day activities, labor, routines, and health. And so as Mercury retrogrades through here, you're going to be rethinking this whole area of your life, your health, day-to-day activities, work, especially related to like education too. But as Mercury goes back into your 5th house of love, romance, sex, pleasure, art, music, self-expression, children, all the fun stuff, there's something there that you need to be a little bit more clear on. However, Mercury will station direct square Saturn in your 2nd house of money, finances, resources, possessions. So I feel like there's something getting in the way of education, work, and money. And I think Mercury might go back in your 5th house, so you might have a fun time, but maybe you don't have the money for it. And I think pleasure and money is going to be a big thing for you guys, especially related to education and work. Then we get to Aquarius. Mercury rules your 8th house of death, other people's money, shared resources, things out of your control, inheritance. But Mercury also rules your 5th house of love, romance, sex, pleasure, children, self-expression, all the fun stuff, right? So as Mercury retrogrades through here, you're going to be rethinking this whole area. Mercury will go back into your 4th house of home, family, living situation, and it will then square Saturn, which is in your 1st house. That's been pretty hard for you guys. But as Mercury goes back into your 4th house, there's something that you're going to have to come back to focus on when it comes to home, family, and living situation. That means you're probably going to have to take as it squares Saturn, take more responsibility for, put more effort into, or feel like there's going to be more distance there. And then last but not least, we get to Pisces. And Pisces, Mercury rules your seventh house of relationships, other people, individuals, all types of individuals in relationships, even client work too. But Mercury also rules your fourth house of home, family, living situation, your roots. And as Mercury goes retrograde here, you're going to be rethinking this whole area of your life. And Mercury will go back into your third house of short distance travel, communication, scheduling, siblings, short distance. I already said short distance travel. The third house rules a lot of stuff, but as Mercury goes back into your third house, you're going to have to put a bigger emphasis on this third house stuff. So again, plans, communication, even siblings. But Mercury will square Saturn in your 12th house. The 12th house rules isolation, alienation, the subconscious, fears, and hidden enemies. And as Saturn's been there, it's been a little bit rough, especially related to like friends and stuff like that. But as Mercury squares Saturn, there's something about your plans or the way that you communicate or even write, that something about your subconscious or your fears, that's going to get in the way. Like something is going to get in the way of that. And I'm not really sure. The 12th house rules a lot of weird things. So this could be a delay that's out of your control or things that you didn't expect to see coming. So that is all of the signs. And that's what I have for everyone about this Mercury retrograde in Gemini. Typically, I'm also assuming no one's watching at this point, but typically Mercury retrogrades are propagated as the end of the world, and they're not really going to be the end of the world for everyone. It is, though, a big rethink and a big shift in the way that you, again, understand something, your plans and communication and things like that. So anyway, if you found this video helpful, please give me a like. It super helps me out in the algorithm. Leave me a comment. Let me know what's going on for you in your life and what sign you are, so I know exactly, how to interpret it. But let me know what you think this Mercury retrograde is going to be doing for you in the comments below. And again, if you really like those graphic animations and you're really interested in learning how to read your own birth chart or, again, how to just be better at astrology, please consider taking my course. It's quite affordable and it's packed with good information, and it's not forever long. It's a very short, easy course that I think that you'll get a lot out of. So anyway, with that being said, thank you guys so much, and I'll be seeing you next retrograde.